As I sort of learned more and really discovered that this, in many ways, is the greatest injustice that we've ever sort of created on Earth. This idea that 9 individuals really could just end the world if they wanted to in 30 minutes, a few hours.
That's the voice of Beatrice Fihn, the former executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, known by its shorthand ICAN. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Kalina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, how was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. My weekend was a lot of fun. I got a chance to see an improv show close by and spend some time with my cousins. So it was a really great weekend. How was yours?
Very nice, very nice. It was great. Saw my mom this weekend. The weather is warming up here in Washington, so all is good.
Well, I'm glad, and I hope that you and your family are having fun in the warm weather. But Tom, what's the latest on the nuclear front?
Well, the fragile nature of the U.S.-China relationship was on tragic display last week as a Chinese spy balloon sent Washington into a panic. The balloon was first spotted over Montana, which, as our listeners know, is home to Malmstrom Air Force Base, where U.S. nuclear-armed missiles are deployed. The balloon then traveled across the United States and was shot down off the coast of South Carolina. The Navy and Coast Guard are now working to retrieve the popped balloon. Three things to note about this. First is that China and the United States spy on each other all the time. The only unusual thing about this is that it was so out in the open. Second, China has used balloons to spy on us numerous times before, but they do not tend to drift across the entire country in the process. And third, balloons are not a particularly novel or effective way of spying, since China has satellites in space which can pretty much do the same thing. And yet the U.S.-China relationship is such that what should have been a minor event has become a crisis and forced Secretary of State Blinken to cancel a high-level visit to Beijing. And of course, the irony is that the meeting was supposed to be about lowering tensions between the two nations so minor things, like a spy balloon, would not lead to international crises. Oh well. Let's hope the two sides can put this incident behind them and set up a new meeting soon. Turning to U.S.-Russia relations, the U.S. State Department last week sent a report to Congress stating that Russia is not in compliance with the New START treaty. New START, as our listeners know, is the last remaining U.S.-Russian treaty that limits nuclear weapons. The backstory here is that during COVID, the two countries agreed to halt inspections of nuclear weapons under the treaty, but that these inspections were meant to start up again last summer. Then Russia balked at resuming the inspections and canceled a meeting to talk about it, which was planned last November in Cairo. Russia is doing this apparently to protest U.S. support for Ukraine and is hoping to use New START as leverage. This comes at a really bad time as the treaty is set to expire 3 years from now in 2026, and it will take some time to work out a replacement. It is hard to see much progress being made on this year as the war in Ukraine rages on. And of course, next year is an election year, which makes things difficult. And after that, we just simply don't know who the president will be. So let's hope Russia realizes that New START is in its interests and agrees to talk to the Biden administration about next steps, because having the treaty collapse benefits no one and could launch us into a new arms race. Lauren, what do you have lined up for early warning?
This week on Early Warning, I sat down with Tong Zhao, a senior fellow at Carnegie's nuclear policy program. We discussed the leaked memo by a high-ranking U.S. general predicting a war between the U.S. and China by 2025, and how this is furthering the narrative of the, quote, China threat.
And then Beatrice Fihn joins Emma Belcher to reflect on her time as executive director of ICAN. They discuss Beatrice's long tenure at ICAN, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and her hopes for the future. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline.
Why is a U.S. general predicting war with China by 2025? According to a leaked memo from General Minahan, the odds of a U.S. military conflict with China in 2 years are, quote, very high. He cited Chinese President Xi Jinping's third term and the Taiwan presidential elections in January 2024 as reasons to accelerate troop preparations. A spokesperson for the Defense Department said Minahan's comments are not representative of the department's views on China. In its ambiguous one China policy, the U.S. acknowledges China's sovereignty claims over Taiwan without accepting them and opposes any unilateral changes. Since last year, China has taken an increasingly aggressive posture toward Taiwan, raising the possibility of a war involving the U.S. According to the president of Taiwan, quote, armed confrontation is absolutely not an option for the self-governing island. So what does this all mean for the U.S.-China relationship? To help us look at this situation, today we are joined by Tong Zhao, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a visiting research scholar at Princeton University. Tong, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So what has been happening in the U.S.-China relationship to prompt this stance by a high-ranking U.S. general?
Well, this is happening when the overall U.S.-China relationship is becoming worse and worse. We remembered the relationship was particularly bad during the Trump administration when the U.S. was focusing its pressure campaign on China's political system, on the ruling party. And there was hope in China that with Biden administration in power, relationship could gradually improve and became more pragmatic and normal. But it didn't play out in that way. And from the Chinese perspective, the Biden administration basically continued the Trump administration's policy against China, but became even more effective and efficient in doing so, in strengthening alliances. And the recent, defense documents, the National Defense Strategy, Nuclear Posture Review, etc., they all really portray China as, sometimes even a greater military concern for the United States than Russia. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine even further enhanced the mutual threat perception between the two sides. China thinks that this war is all about Western countries under U.S. leadership weaken Russia as a country, whereas China was viewed by U.S. as being a close partner or teammate on the Russian team. And the invasion also, highlights the increasingly realistic threat of a potential military conflict over the Taiwan Strait. I think this is happening against the background where China itself is shifting towards a Taiwan strategy that used to focus on countering Taiwan independence towards a new policy narrative that focuses more on promoting unification. So there appears to be a greater sense of urgency on the Chinese part to take initiative on unification. But overall, I don't think China has a very clear strategy at all. President Mr. Xi stresses the importance of the Chinese military, the PLA, to prepare for war fighting. We hear that narrative all the time, but we don't know what's the specific strategy over Taiwan. Is there a timeline to reunify Taiwan? And this ambiguity in China's own strategy also creates room for worst-case thinking and speculation in American policy planning. So I think the general's recent remark is a reflection of that. So I think we need more careful analysis in that environment with increasing uncertainty and ambiguity.
Thank you. And you touched on this, the idea of the threat from China and the ambiguity and how it affects the perception of each other. So how do you think that the general's decision to write this memo furthers that narrative of the, quote, China threat?
I think this is just one of the most recent statements from senior U.S. military and civilian officials. We also heard statements from other former or incumbent U.S. officials. We recall Admiral Davidson made this comment about China might launch a war against Taiwan in 2027. There are also increasing war games being played by think tanks in D.C. All of those narratives and activities, I think, raised attention on the issue of Taiwan. Taiwan issue certainly becomes more widely reported in the US, in China, in the international community. It certainly affects increasingly policy debate and deliberation in US allies and other regional countries. Despite its impact regionally and internationally, we actually cannot really tell how real the China threat is. And that's very much because the portrayed China military threat over Taiwan really is a result of the ambiguous Chinese strategy. I don't think China has a plan or has made a decision to invade Taiwan by a certain year, but because in this very closed information environment and in this very strictly controlled public opinion environment, the top leadership has demonstrated an interest to acquire the capability to unify Taiwan if necessary. So it's ambiguous. It's not, yes, we will go and attack Taiwan. It is also not, no, we'll definitely not attack Taiwan. We actually are preparing, for all the contingencies across the spectrum. So it's also hard for Chinese officials and experts to openly fight back against the American narratives about China, wanting to go to war, because it really echoes with some of the domestic discussions. But I think ultimately, if we really think there is a China threat, then the threat is more geopolitical rather than military. The reason I think the risk of a war over Taiwan is growing is because there is a growing information gap and perception gap at the societal level between US and China. They no longer have shared understandings about basic facts, including basic facts about the history and the status quo of Taiwan. China attributes all the troubles to the structural change in the international balance of power, to the point that China believes that the US is now, trying to drive up tensions over the Taiwan Strait. The US might actually want to deliberately provoke a war over Taiwan and to use that as an opportunity to weaken China and to prevent China's further rise. So I think we actually need a more political level efforts to exchange ideas, to understand and address the more underlying and fundamental challenge of this information and perception gap. If we focus too much on the military level, I think that could backfire, because the current US effort to send tough military deterrent signals against China would only make sense if China is really about to attack Taiwan in the near term. But China itself doesn't see itself as trying to initiate a war in the near term. So the US deterrence message was actually read as a threat in Beijing, and it fuels all kinds of conspiracy theories about American geopolitical and hegemonic intent. So I think we may want to better debate what's the nature of the China threat.
Thank you so much, Tong, for your insight. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Ploughshares Fund. We work tirelessly to reduce and eventually eliminate the dangers posed by nuclear weapons, and we're able to do this because of the generosity of supporters and listeners like you. 100% of your tax-deductible gift will be used to support the smartest people with the best ideas. Go to ploughshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Beatrice Fihn stepped down last month from her position as Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. During her leadership for 9 years, ICAN received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and played a vital role in the adoption and implementation of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In her tenure, ICAN has nearly tripled in size, evolved into a powerful global movement for nuclear disarmament, and brought in a whole new generation of activists and advocates. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Beatrice Fihn to reflect on her time at ICAN and her efforts to ban nuclear weapons. Beatrice, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Emma, for having me.
Could you tell me a bit about how you got into this field and this movement to ban nuclear weapons?
Well, I mean, I got into this field by accident, which is something that I've always tried to kind of keep in mind as I've continued this, because I know how it is to not know anything about nuclear weapons and not really having it at the forefront of my mind. I was very interested in things like environmental issues, human rights, humanitarian law, the UN, of course, and got this internship opportunity in Geneva that was paid. And then they sort of shifted around. They're like, oh, it's on nuclear weapons. And I was like, oh, that's so lame. That's so boring. I really thought it was an old-fashioned issue. But as soon as I kind of got involved, and my first boss was actually Susie Snyder, who I have worked with since then, I just got so fascinated by the issue and really understood that as I started digging deeper into the issue of nuclear weapons, how it really connected to those issues that I was really passionate about, sort of justice, equality, humanitarian law, something that maybe as a beginner you don't see the connection to those issues. But as I sort of learned more and really discovered that this, in many ways, is the greatest injustice that we've ever sort of created on Earth, this idea that 9 individuals really could just end the world if they wanted to in 30 minutes, a few hours with the decisions. To me, that was sort of an accidental start on this, and then I got stuck, really.
Tell us about the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. What are the obligations? What's it about?
So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a global international law that completely bans nuclear weapons. It bans the use of nuclear weapons. It also bans the threat to use of nuclear weapons. It bans testing, development, maintenance, possession, and stationing and deployment of nuclear weapons on other territories. So it's really a comprehensive prohibition, very much mimicking the scope of the prohibitions of the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the ban on anti-personnel landmines and cluster bombs. So kind of follows in the same structure of the obligations of the treaty as the other kind of comprehensive bans on weapons that we have under international law. It also adds, and this is the really unique character for a treaty covering nuclear weapons, it adds obligations on providing victim assistance and environmental remediation, which is really these kind of positive obligations, things that governments aren't prohibited from doing, but should be doing. And this is a really important part because it also kind of addressed the humanitarian impacts that we've already seen from nuclear weapons. And I'm really excited to see the implementation of the treaty in the coming years, kind of delving into setting up trust funds for victims of nuclear testing, for example, and all these other initiatives that we can do to really help people on the ground with this treaty.
In January 22 marked 2 years since the TPNW entered into force. What was the process to get the treaty signed and entered into force?
It's a huge effort. And I think that a lot of people sort of kind of underestimate how much work it is to get a country to sign and ratify the treaty. And sometimes there's a misconception in this field about non-nuclear weapon states not taking this as seriously. They're not as important as the nuclear armed state. But I mean, we are having to work with governments all over the world through parliamentary hearing process, national legislation initiatives, and really kind of shepherd this treaty through the different processes of a lot of domestic ratification processes around the world. So it's been a really hard work, but of course also we've seen a lot of commitment from these countries. Ratifying a treaty is not quick, as we're noticing, and sometimes we're a lot more impatient than governments are. But it's also been incredibly interesting to see the kind of depth of commitment from a lot of these countries. It's everything from nagging different desk officers in different departments on WhatsApp, to writing briefing notes, to making phone calls, to having hearings in parliaments and kind of seminars with different ministries and departments. Just a lot of kind of groundwork. It's not so glamorous and exotic as accepting the Nobel Peace Prize maybe, but it's like really important work that is done every day around the world in this campaign.
A lot of people, when they think about nuclear weapons, think, what on earth can we do about it? It's a problem for countries. It's all very secretive. What do you say to people who say that civil society doesn't have a role to play when it comes to nuclear weapons?
I think it's completely wrong to say that, because what we've seen also in the past is when we've had these huge progresses in the world on nuclear weapons, civil society and the public has very much been involved. From the massive protests from doctors and regular moms in the 50s and 60s that stopped atmospheric testing, for example, because they developed strontium in baby teeth, and how the nuclear testing was impacting people everywhere. to huge global movements in the 80s, protests and kind of demonstrations, 1 million people marching in the US, in New York, in Central Park, around the world, everywhere, that kind of really pushed Reagan and Gorbachev to negotiate nuclear disarmament in the 80s. So we see that civil society is absolutely essential. It's not that we're not necessary, it's actually the opposite. Without civil society, and the times when we haven't seen a lot of civil society engagement is when we've seen no progress. And when we're seeing really little, pressure on governments to do something. And this idea that it's only for governments, it's only for the 9 leaders of the nuclear armed states, for example, to me, it seems like a very intentional strategy to keep this out of people's minds and make people feel disempowered. And the only ones that benefit from that are the people who possess these weapons and want to be left alone with the decisions. So I think, when you start getting involved in this issue, you sort of pull back the curtains of the mysterious decision making and seeing that this is just regular people taking decisions. There are a lot more actors involved in upholding the system than we think it is. I mean, that's why it's so important for campaigns like ICAN to explain how it all works and explain how people can get involved in very easy to understand terms to make it accessible to people.
You've told us about the TPNW. Critics, though, of it say that it suffers from not having any nuclear weapon states as states party and that it never will. What do you say to these critics?
Well, I mean, first, we don't have any nuclear weapon states joining this treaty yet. And I refuse to not say that word yet because it is not decided yet. Things can change very much in the future. It took China and France like 25 years to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We hope to do it faster this time with these 2 countries. And I think also it depends a little bit about how you see these treaties and what the purpose of them are. I mean, some people see treaties as the kind of final confirmation of a decision the governments have already made. So that when all governments have changed their mind about nuclear weapons, that's when we do the treaty that bans nuclear weapons to just sort of solidify that. We see it as we can't wait for that. That's not going to happen unless we push. And not all 197 countries or whatever it is going to be ready at the same time. It's naive to think that all governments will just be ready exactly at the same time. And it won't be one government who has a domestic situation that makes it difficult. So we need to start with some. So it's really about, we see the treaty as a tool to get us closer to it, and as a pressure point, and as an instrument to mobilize people and to mobilize the rest of the world to put pressure on the nuclear weapon states. So we will continue to work to get these countries to join the treaty, but even if they don't, it still has an impact and it still influences and shapes behavior. And I think that's a huge advantage of this treaty.
There's been a steady increase in support for the TPNW. What impact, if any, has Russia's invasion of Ukraine and President Putin's nuclear threats had on the growing support for the treaty?
Well, I think that for everyone working on nuclear weapons, this past year has been really overwhelming, scary, but also hugely sort of raising the profile of the issue. At least I know that I felt so much, this year that her work is so meaningful and so important at this moment. And so many people have said it to us, like, I'm so glad that there are people doing this kind of work. So in that way, it's like a huge motivating factor, both for governments and for regular people. I remember, in 2013, when we started the humanitarian initiative and this kind of idea of talking about what would happen if nuclear weapons were used. People were almost laughing at it and say, like, well, why were you speculating about it? It's never going to happen. That's just silly to talk about that. And now we're in a situation where we actually have to talk about it. And that's both really scary, but also a sign that these warnings that civil society, scientists have been doing on climate change, on nuclear weapons, on pandemics, I mean, we need to listen to them because eventually it will happen. So what we're seeing is that, of course, a whole new generation is kind of discovering nuclear weapons issues, right? And the issue, and a lot of people who have not thought about this issue since the 1980s, maybe. It's sort of back on the agenda again and getting a really sort of high profile in media, in conversations. And of course, as always, when these things happen, some people will react like we need more weapons, more nuclear weapons. We also need nuclear weapons. But I think a lot of people also see what's happening right now. And I think there's a possibility to change a lot of people's minds about nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. Because to me, what Russia is doing, launching an illegal invasion under the threat of nuclear weapons, really highlights how vulnerable we are to these weapons. And it makes us incredibly vulnerable. And what we're seeing from our Western government is that don't believe deterrence. We're not deterred. Like, do not believe in nuclear threats, but somehow assuming that Russia will believe our nuclear threats. I think that everything is kind of changing. I think that the issue of nuclear deterrence and believing that nuclear weapons protect us and it's a sign of strength, it's very possible to change public opinion about that right now because everything is changing very rapidly. And we're seeing a lot of countries being more motivated to join the treaty. To be honest, I mean, there's a lot more countries joining the treaty than countries that are starting to support nuclear weapons right now. And I think it's important for us to remember that and not just see everything as awful and going in the wrong direction, but also remind ourselves how many governments, even under these circumstances, are choosing to prohibit completely nuclear weapons and not go for that option.
That's a great perspective because certainly the news is dominated with the opposite.
Yep. Yeah, and I think we're very used to always looking at this issue so negatively. I often get the questions like, oh, the nuclear disarmament movement haven't succeeded. I was like, well, have you looked outside? Have we had nuclear war? No. So every day there's not nuclear war, we win. But somehow we've gotten into a place where the complete elimination and zero nuclear weapons would be acceptable result, whereas it's kind of work in progress. Everything that we do and every single government that doesn't develop nuclear weapons, despite the insistence of the most powerful that this is the best weapon ever, it's quite incredible that we managed to avoid nuclear war, that we managed to not have more countries develop nuclear weapons.
In June of 2022, states parties to the TPNW met in Vienna for the first time. And ICAN also held a ban forum prior to that. I was fortunate to participate in it. And what really inspired me and impressed me was the diversity and background and expertise of those I met. And I'm curious, what actions did you see come out of this and the momentum you built in the grassroots and activist space since June? And what do you hope carries on from it?
I mean, I think there was such an incredible event. And really, despite the very awful backdrop, right, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we're seeing the impact of that on Ukrainian people and just this kind of general fear of nuclear war in the world. It was so nice to see so many people come together. A lot of new people, a lot of really young people and people from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, from the Pacific Island states, a lot of young people from impacted communities, Pacific Island states, Kazakhstan, different nuclear test sites around the world. And I think that having those voices is incredibly important. I'm so excited to have seen since then a lot of these youth participants, Youth for TPNW, it's a network that has formed and they're doing lots of activities. They're going to organize a retreat soon where they're going to just gather for a weekend to kind of discuss what to do next. There's a network of African young people in favor of the TPNW that is also organizing and posting TikToks and sort of trying to educate people. So we see all of these kind of things. We also have a kind of emerging network of Eastern European activists and researchers and academics that we're working with, trying to sort of engage in quite a complicated context where it's not always possible for people to speak up on these issues in Russia, in Belarus, in other countries. But really trying to kind of make it easy for people to engage and also make it a bit fun, because these issues are really difficult to handle. And I think that's one of the things I feel so proud of what ICAN has done and achieved is that, when I, walked around just kind of buzzing in Vienna at the forum and like seeing all these people, we had our own little labeled beer, ICAN branded beer, for example. This is a long fight and we're going to be doing this for a long time and it's not going to be easy for anyone. So we better have a bit of fun at the same time and find community and find sort of this kind of traditional, like it's not the end destination, it's the road or the way there, right? That's the point. And to make sure that people have the energy to keep this up. I think it was a huge motivating factor for people. And also added to that it was the first event that we organized in person since the pandemic started. So people were also just like so excited about seeing each other again, because this kind of work is hard enough as it is. And to be able to just do it at home in front of your computer every day has been rough on a lot of people. So just finding that support and that community, finding people from all over the world that shares the same sort of ideas and excitement as you, I think it was really meaningful to people.
You've successfully highlighted the effects nuclear weapons have on marginalized communities in working to ban nuclear weapons. What are some of those stories you'd like people to know more about?
I mean, I think that the experiences of people who have suffered the impacts of these weapons need to be at the center of all of our policy decisions. I mean, this is really an issue about human beings. And unfortunately, what we see, not just on this issue, but on other issues, is that when we stop seeing the consequences for people and just look at structures and systems, it's very easy to take decisions that are very dangerous for human beings. So bringing these voices is such an important reminder, I think, about what it is that we talk about. We talk about a weapon of mass destruction meant to wipe out whole civilian populations. And when people talk about strategic stabilities and nuclear deterrence, policies, they're talking about threatening to mass murder civilians, committing war crimes and the most unspeakable sort of crimes against humanity, wiping out whole towns and cities. And I think that bringing these voices is such an important part, and it really shifts the way that you talk about it. So for me, of course, the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are incredibly important because by today's standard, that's a small nuclear weapon. And when we talked about, when we had so much coverage around Russia's threats to use nuclear weapons and this kind of bizarre narrative that, it would probably be a small nuclear weapon, just a tactical nuclear bomb. I mean, that's like Hiroshima sized, which killed 140,000 people. It's just like such a massive amount. So I think that those stories are really important. But I also think, the nuclear test sites, because we have this kind of false idea that nuclear weapons have kept the peace for all these years and it's been very safe and no war happened, but it completely disregards all the people that have suffered and still suffers today from nuclear weapons. Anything from military people who have been handling these weapons to the people around the test sites. And for people like in the Pacific, for example, I think in countries like Marshall Islands or Kiribati, I mean, they are sort of, in many ways, they are facing the real existential threat right now with climate change and raising sea levels, which happens to be the same countries behind the most emissions as nuclear weapons. They were used as test sites, as guinea pigs almost, against their will and not being informed about it in the past. And I think it's just such a stark reminder how connected these weapons are to ideas around colonialism, what people matters and what doesn't matter. If you look at all the nuclear armed states, and where they have tested, it's on indigenous communities' land. It is on former colonies. Soviet tested in Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, actually, in places where they didn't care as much about the people. So that's also why I think it's important that we bring those stories up, and they have the right to remain safe. And I also think that that's the whole approach behind the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and why we're promoting the right of every country to stand up against this, because this isn't just up to the 9 nuclear armed states to decide. If Biden and Putin goes to nuclear war, me and my family here in Switzerland will die and be harmed and impacted. And how do I have a say in this? I don't give them permission or approval to do that. So this is a way for the rest of the world to also influence decisions that will impact them.
You've already referred to this in your previous answer, but taking a look at the nuclear field now and what's already been accomplished, in what ways do you feel inspired and hopeful about the future?
I've seen a lot of changes over the almost decade that I've been in this role. It has begun to become much more inclusive, much more diverse. There's a whole new generation kind of coming in and getting also leadership positions. And I think that's really, really important. I think it's very important that we don't let kind of the nuclear weapons establishment sprinkle a bit of diversity and say, fix, this is great. We also have to make sure that it doesn't just lead to putting people on panels but like repeating the same points over and over again. And it's not just a way of indoctrinating new people into the old thinking, but also to leave space for new ideas and kind of challenging this. And I also really do think that ICAN has contributed to making it much more possible to be in favor of nuclear disarmament. That you don't have to, in order to have a career in this field, in order to be respected in this field, don't have to sort of adjust to the very kind of narrow mindset of the nuclear armed states of what is possible. That you can be a little bit bolder, you can be a little bit more radical and ask for more than what the current governments are willing to consider. And that I'm like really, really proud of, for us to kind of like pushing open for new people and new perspectives and giving space to that.
Beatrice, thank you for all the work that you've done for this field and this movement, and all the very best for what lies ahead. We hope we see much more of you.
I'm sure you will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.